Interesting, that process, because eventually someone twigged to what it was. But we had to go through one or two options before we got to that point. Also, it was actually helpful to have someone in the room that knew what it really was. A group discernment process. As we work out and talk and share and reflect and test out what something might be. Discerning what God is doing is a process that sometimes, I don't know about you, but you want to think that it's actually discernment is that someone will just have the exact answer at the right time and it'll be obvious to everyone. And that God might even give us a sign. In the section before the gospel reading that Barry read for us, the scribes and the Pharisees were asking for a sign. But what was their intention? Was it because they were thinking that Jesus maybe was God's son and that they wanted to learn more and to go more along that path? Or was there something else on their mind? And why did Jesus not give them the sign or the answer that they were looking for? There's a clue at the end of the gospel passage. When Peter said that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus said to the disciples after the keys, what? Do not tell people that I am the Messiah. Do not tell. But was he saying do not communicate it, or was he just saying do not tell? Christine, you were saying? Yep. You're on the right track. Go on, say it.
Yes. Well,
Tell is communicating, yes. But is that the way that people will respond to? You know those people who think you're doing something wrong? Something that's unwise? Have you had the experience where you tell them why you're doing it and then they don't believe you? They still think you're wrong. Or you tell someone that's dangerous. You shouldn't be doing that. The consequences of this are. And they don't take any notice. So sometimes telling people doesn't actually change their mindset if their mindset is already made up of what they think the issue is about. And I think that's what is happening in the Matthew reading. The scribes and the Pharisees were wanting to be able to not see the signs to help them to recognise God at work, but to use those signs against Jesus to show that they weren't real signs. Someone convinced against their will is never, their mind is not changed. But it also relates back to the Romans reading, which talks about it's a whole body experience. How do we discern what God is saying to us? It's something that we need to grow into. People do not usually get the lightning bulb moment where all of a sudden everything becomes clear and everything is laid out for them simply. Usually we get a flash of insight, we see part of the picture. God calls us into what? The next step in the journey or growth. And see, some people talk about discernment as more like a growth process, like plants grow, than actually something where the switch is just turned on and it becomes clear to everyone. So what's happening in the growth process as we learn to discern something? We have to listen, yes. We have to learn to listen to God. And we've got to be able to tell what God sounds like compared to what I sound like when I'm thinking that I'm God and that I know the answer. We need to be able to tell the difference. When is that voice? And there are some people that... Sorry? What were you going to say, Olga? No, it's all right. We'll come back to it. Yes, Joe?
I think there's an invitation in there to reflect on who we are and check our motives and our prejudices.
Yep, so Joan's saying a chance for us to reflect on who we are and our motives and our prejudices. Yes, because if we have a particular prejudice, that will affect the way that we see something. And we usually see that in some of the news broadcasts, don't we? Because we actually sometimes see our prejudice reflected back to us, because what's on the news, it's what's going to stir something up in us, because that's what's designed to do, because it's trying to hook into our prejudices. I've noticed particularly on some of the news reports on YouTube about a number of different things, they'll say this outlandish statement, which they call hookbait? Clickbait, that's it. And what it is, they want, when you actually play the video clip, you find out it's nothing to do with what they were saying. They don't even mention the bit that's there. It's just designed to get you in to click on that, because it's beneficial for them if you click on their YouTube clip. So we've got to be aware of the things that actually trigger us and affect the way we perceive things. That's a growth process, isn't it, of learning to see the world differently than maybe the way we have in the past. That sometimes our prejudices are made up because of our experience or things we've heard or things we've believed. And they may not always be the full picture. So discernment is about learning to do things differently. Now, the other interesting thing about discerning is keys. Which was the main set of keys that you got that were significant for you in your life? Who got a 21st birthday key? Did that open doors for you? First car keys, yep. And the house key, first time you were entrusted with a house key. Of course, this only applies to people in the city, because I don't know that we ever had a house key when I was growing up, but yes. The privilege and responsibility and the keys that were given, and the way that we drive. And some of us may have even learnt to drive by someone who taught us to drive very carefully, to follow all the road rules, and to get home safely. But then sometimes we may have noticed, I've got a grandson who sits in the back, and when you go over the speed limit, he makes a noise. And when you go under, he makes a noise. Because for him, doing exactly what the speed limit is, that's his personality is such that that's what he wants you to do. And even if it's only 1 or 2 kilometres over, and he doesn't understand that the speedo is actually reading higher than what the reality is, that doesn't matter. It's what's there on the speedo is what's important. But sometimes the people we've learnt from, they might have said don't speed, but you may have noticed that sometimes they do. And when you get in a situation where you're running late, which voice do you listen to? See, it all depends, doesn't it? We can learn something from watching people. We can learn something from what they say. And isn't that what Jesus is saying to the scribes and the Pharisees? It's what you do with yourselves and the way that you live and act. And that's what Paul's saying about bodily worship. It's about the way that we connect with God, not just in what we say, not just in what we think, but it's physically what we do, what we see and what we hear. And there are some things that can distract us from recognising God's presence and make it harder to hear, and there are things that can actually help us. And that's what Paul is saying about presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice. It's not just our thinking. It's not about necessarily knowing the right interpretation of a Bible verse, although that can help. It's much more about the way that we live out God's presence and allow the Holy Spirit to work in and through us that makes a difference. And do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I don't think that just means our thinking. I think that's a whole perception thing. It's our whole ability to perceive and see. Had that experience where you've thought one thing about a group of people, and then when you've actually got to know someone, you actually learn a whole lot of things around those people's experience, which changes your understanding, your perception of these people. Changes what you think about them. So what we do with our body makes a difference. Now, I've got a photo to show you. That's me skiing. Who's really good at skiing here? Not here, but I mean really good at skiing on the slopes. Anyone? A bit like that. Olga, are you really good?
Not good.
Not good.
No.
Yeah, after this experience I went to a toboggan and I haven't gone back. They taught you how to turn the skis when you want to stop going forwards. It's a bit different when you start moving backwards. The skis don't quite work in the same way. I was reading a book on discernment, and it wasn't on discernment, it's actually called Imagination in Action. So it's about creativity. And it's describing creativity as like a force of nature. It's something we can tap into. And that we all have the potential to be creative. But not all of us know how to tap into that and are willing to learn how to do it, to make the steps to do it. And what the author, Sean McNiff, is saying is that really it's a matter of stepping out and doing something, and you learn from that, and that gives you, all of a sudden, some other options come to mind, and you explore doing that. Book week last week. I had to make 2 masks. One was Moonface and one was Mr. Shark. Now, if they don't mean anything to you, ask someone else. They'll tell you. They're characters from 2 books. Working out how to make these masks for grandson and daughter at school was an interesting process, because you're looking around for, now what can we use for eyes on the shark, because they bulge out, right? And I'm thinking, what do we use? And then there was this plastic ball nearby, which was one of those balls that bounces, which is solid, not a hollow one. I thought if I cut that in half, which to my grandson was a great distraction to cut it in half. You can't do that. But it's all right, we had a spare one. So it was all right to cut it. And then you sort of think about how to make that look like an eye. One step leads to another. And that's what McNiff is saying about creativity. It's doing one thing and exploring and learning from others what they do to actually create something. And I thought, to me, that's what discernment and faith are about. It's about stepping out and trying something, learning a bit more, and you go along. And sometimes we use a journey, but he uses nature and like something that's growing and blossoming. It's more like a force of nature, is what he's saying, and tapping into that force. And I thought, that's so much like connecting with God, of recognising the role of the Spirit around us and connecting, allowing that to help us to see things differently, but also giving us the courage to do something differently. So back to the skiing. In one chapter in the book, which is called, it's chapter 3, he was talking about putting it into action, creativity and putting it into action, and describing the story of someone who was trying to ski and they couldn't do it. They kept, watching their skis and knees, and it wasn't working. And I could identify with that. But then they decided what they needed to do was just let their legs do the work and follow the contours of what was there and just allow the gravity to actually work with them and to move with it. And they found it was much easier to ski than when they were concentrating on getting it perfect and doing the steps right. Now, I don't suggest you try that on a big slope. It's always good to start on the little gentle slopes. But there's something in that actually when we move and take a step and do something, our muscle memory and of movement can actually help us different than what our brain might, and our brain might be telling us something different. And a feeling might be telling us something totally different about how cold this stuff is. And I think discernment is like that. Sometimes we can get so caught up in wondering what's the right thing to do that we don't actually step out because we become too afraid, or too many voices, we become a bit confused about what we need to do. But to actually just take a step and to have a go will enable us to do something different. Muscle memory is amazing. There are people with dementia that can still sing a song, play the piano. The muscle memory is amazing in the way that it allows people, when they start doing something, to just tap into that muscle memory. And I think that's what Paul's talking about as well, about renewing our minds. Because if we're living in a certain way and our bodies are expressing that with God, then we've got muscle memory that helps us at times where maybe we find it harder to know what to do or where God is in a situation, because it's the faith muscle memory that allows us to actually come back to somewhere where we can start again and trust in what's going on. The other thing that McMith talks about is group discernment. And he describes it like this: we can do so much more in creating what I call slip streams of expression, where group and environmental forces carry us much further along than we can go alone. We can do so much more in creating what I call slip streams of expression, where group and environmental forces carry us much further along than we can go alone. That's why we come to church, isn't it? That's why we go to morning tea. That's why we do all sorts of things that we've done in the past, of mission and of fellowship and of ways of communicating the gospel. Slip streams of expression, something that enables us to rise up in a way that we weren't able to before. We as a congregation need to support each other and the gifts that we have to be a place where the bodies and the gifting that God gives us enable us to not only worship God in church, but also worship God in all that we do, and the ways that we encourage and support each other and use the gifts that God has given us.